Hi guys, hello and welcome to my latest video, which is going to be a collaboration with Christina from Gussets and Godets. This video is going to be going in specifically into sewing a vintage style lining into a coat. This coat is fantastic. It's actually Butterick 5824, which was released several years ago and is actually out of print. So you may be able to find this on eBay or Etsy. Random places might still have it, but it is this beautiful circle skirt swing coat. I've linked Christina's post down below in the comments, or I'm sorry, in the description section, in case you wanted to check it out. I definitely recommend it. Her coat is absolutely gorgeous, and she kind of goes into a bunch of different techniques that I did not do in my coat, but I really love how hers turned out, so please check it out. For this video though, I am going into putting in a lining in a very vintage way. So you can follow the directions in your pattern and put in your lining like that. You can bag your lining and do your jacket that way. The way that I'm doing it is literally following a step-by-step process from a reference book from the 1940s. I'll be including that as a free download. There's going to be the link in the description or on my website in case you guys wanted to get a, kind of like an outline of everything that I cover in this video. It's not hard, but it is time consuming. To be honest, I'm all about doing it the old-fashioned way, so using a 1940s reference it's all me. So anyway, hope you guys enjoy this video and bye. So 2017 is supposed to be my year of making jackets. So I actually pulled out a couple of my vintage jackets from my closet and kind of took a look at how the lining is put into them, because linings can be so complicated for so many people. So I figured I'd do some research and learn and teach you guys how to put in a lining in a vintage way. So the jacket that I'm working on is part of a collaboration, and definitely stick around towards the end. I'll have some videos of this sorted out, but you can see that I have made the jacket except for the lining. So on the jacket, everything on the outside has already been made, and it is a huge jacket. The skirt is huge, so there's going to be a lot of lining going on in this. So in my research about this, putting in linings in a vintage way, the number one thing that I read was that the lining needs to be put in how it is worn. So no weird turny, flippy, whatever. It is literally going to be slipped and stitched directly onto the jacket in the way that it's going to be worn. So I have my jacket spread out. I have my lining completely sewn up and stitched up. So what I'm going to do is lay it over the garment completely. And then I'm going to stick the arms into the armholes as if it is being worn. So putting everything in, and I'm spreading out the lining in the bottom. So in order to do this properly, you essentially have to function as if the lining is flat against the garment, like how it's going to be worn. So what I'm going to do is kind of straighten out the lining according to the seam lines and everything in here. So for example, on this particular sleeve, the seam lines are on the top, so I am going to line up those seams as closely as I can. I'm going to stick this through here and kind of tug since it's a straight line. And same thing on the bottom. Cool. And same thing on the sleeves all the way around, as well as in the bottom. So I'm just straightening that out, trying to get them in the general area. Cool. So once you have that generally sorted out, especially in the area that you're going to be working, the first thing you got to do is take care of tacking this down in order to be worn. So I'm going to be tacking in the side seams of this to the jacket. So I have the waist seam of the lining and I have the waist seam of the jacket. So I'm going to kind of stick this here and I'm going to do some running stitches along the edge. So I'm going to go ahead and pin this in place so it doesn't wiggle. Now when you're tacking this stuff down, you're going to want to tack it against the seam allowance. In my case, I'm not too worried about it just because the seam allowance, it also includes the underlining. And so even if I were to sew this against the underlining, it would still stay put on the jacket. To do this kind of waist to underarm seam is so that it doesn't twist and pull, you know, when you're walking or moving around. So I've pinned it in place and I'm going to go ahead and start stitching just these two edges here. So when you're sewing these guys in place, you want to make sure to use a running stitch, which is actually a super simple stitch. It's nothing crazy or complicated. That way you are able to kind of do it quickly. Because to be quite honest, there's going to be a lot of hand sewing in this. So don't get yourself all in a tizzy about it. Just relax and enjoy the process. I'm going to go ahead and just stitch the seam allowance of my lining to the seam allowance of the shell of the jacket using a simple running stitch. And I'm just going from under the arm side to the waist seam. Hand sewing standing up is always really tricky. So at this point I've gone ahead and tacked it down at the side seams. So in order to start making this work, you're going to want to start at the top. So I am just going to start matching up the top of the neck and I'm kind of pulling it out and making sure that it matches up with my waist seam. And I'm going to start pinning the lining to the shell of the jacket. Now be aware with me right now, I am not worrying about turning in the seam allowance. I am literally just pinning it there so that I can get a little bit more of an accurate pull on it once I start working down the side of the jacket. Now you just have to remember that, you know, back in the day, you know, the linings were actually switched out pretty often. Some of the resources that I was looking at for this were pointing out that, you know, you want to make sure to use a really nice lining fabric, so you don't have to do this all the time, but you can imagine that if for whatever reason the first part of the jacket that you could update and change and kind of improve was the lining. So as I'm pinning, I'm making sure to match up any seams or anything that needs to be matched. So right now I am matching up the waist seam of the lining to the waist seam of the shell, just to make sure that those match up once all is said and done. So the lining is going to be really forgiving once you put it completely into the jacket, just because it's going to be flexible in the way that you sew it in place by hand, and you're not, you know, so you're not machine stitching it in and then it has no give. So it'll move a little bit more comfortably against your body as you walk, and when you take it off, when you hang it up, all that sort of thing, it'll be flexible and hang comfortably in your closet rather than just kind of being stiff. That's the last thing you want, your clothes being stiff, and then they end up getting damaged a lot faster when there's not enough ease and movement in them. So at this point, the lining is pinned at the neck and along the side seams. So we're actually gonna be focusing on the bottom, and I'm not gonna lie, this jacket is huge and it is heavy and it is a lot. actually it's like 5 yards of fabric. So lining, pinning the bottom is gonna suck, but it's, you know, it's par for the course. So what I'm gonna do is just focus on the bottom now. So I'm just kind of fixing that. Now the thing with the vintage jackets is that, or at the very least, everything that I looked at, is that the lining is pinned up just a little bit more in the center than it is on the edges, and I think it just more has to do with when you're walking, whether or not it's going to show. Another thing to keep in mind is that you have to decide whether or not you are going to have a free lining, so like a lining that moves around, or a lining that is completely tacked to the hem. I'm going to be doing it tacked to the hem just because I prefer it that way. I don't want to see all the stitching on the inside, even though I have this really pretty hem binding there. So what I'm going to do now is essentially kind of rotate things around and get started, because this is going to take a while. So with this hem, what I'm going to do first is line up the seams of the lining to the seams of the shell. This is more for me just to make sure that things are lining up properly and that the lining is generally where it's supposed to be. So the next thing you want to do is fold under all the hem of the lining, which if you made sure to hang it up overnight, you know, like in my case with it being a circle skirt, it would have stretched out. So I am generally eyeballing it. You're more than welcome to use kind of a gauge to like actually accurately measure it out. For my purposes, I don't, because I like to live on the wild side, but also because it's a huge circle skirt and I'm not going to get it exact. So the most I can do is just make sure to tug it, make sure that it generally falls where it needs to fall, especially since I'll be using an invisible stitch to kind of get it in place. So it doesn't have to be exact, but I do want to make sure that it, at the very least, it is fitting in the area it's supposed to. So from there, what you're going to want to do is take some pins, and you're going to be pinning it to the garment just to kind of more finalize a little bit more where it's going to be and where these things are going to hang directly. So I am pinning the lining with the fold directly to the shell, and in my case, since it's a circle skirt, I'm following along the circle, and on places where I do have a little bit more of a curve, I'm checking it, the lining waist against the shell waist, to make sure that it is even as I go along the curves. So we've just got to the center back of the entire shell. So what I'm gonna do is make sure that the hem for the lining is up a little bit higher than it was at the very beginning. So I've tapered it up towards the middle, and then it's gonna taper back down when I get to the other overlap of the jacket. So I'm gonna go ahead and double check my lining to the waist seam and go ahead and pin it. So when you get to the end of the hem, you want to make sure to compare how much you've tucked under on the lining from one side of the hem to the other. So I'm right now double checking that I have the same distance up from the bottom on the lining on both sides, and then tacking that in place. And then after I did this, putting in the last pin, I'm double checking against the center seam and making sure that the edges right by the facing are lower than the center of the hem. Cool. So at this point, we're almost done pinning everything. Oh, there's so many pins. So I'm now going to deal with the sleeves. So same thing with this, just like you did on the hem. You want to make sure everything lines up. And with this, I'm probably not going to be as strict about it when I do it anyway. So I'm just making sure that the seams line up. And then I'm going to turn them under, then turn this guy under, and turn this back. Just so you can kind of get a guide, and then you can kind of get it in place. Now I'm just going to make sure there's about an inch or so of space between the hem of the lining and the hem of the jacket, so you can kind of see it's falling in at that last little bit, won't tuck in. Okay. So now that the entire coat is completely pinned to the lining, we're not done yet with the hem. So what we're gonna do is we're going to unpin the lining from the shell and just pin the lining to itself, so that the lining is essentially lying free. Now, if you are gonna be doing this bottom part via machine, in terms of trying to have the lining completely free, at this point you would hem it with the machine. But since I'm doing it all by hand, what I'm going to do is take my scissors and I'm going to trim down the bottom of the hem. Now I'm going to still leave like a big kind of underlap on this, just because I want a little bit of wiggle room just in case my pinning was not sufficient. So I'm just kind of trimming it down so that it's kind of even, and snip, and got that. And I'm going to kind of let it sit back down on the hem. And for me, I'm just gonna pin it back down to the shell for the final hemming. But now it's trimmed, so it's not as baggy underneath anymore. So I'm going to go ahead and just keep moving down to the next panel and freeing up the lining from the shell. And then once I finish pinning this lining to itself, I'll go ahead and trim it. So by this time, everything's pinned, the entire hem is trimmed down, so you are finally ready to see the light and to finish this. So you have to start at the neck and then work your way down and then do the hem at the very end. So first thing I'm gonna do is start removing pins a little bit at a time, but only so much to remove them, to tuck in the seam allowance, repin it real fast, and then do that for, I would recommend doing it on sections. I mean, this is just generally how I work, because otherwise you just want to make sure to take your time and not to get ahead of yourself going all the way around. So I'm just literally going to turn in that lining at the neck, and one more pin. Cool, so the lining is turned under at the neck, and at that point is when you start sewing it in. If you're concerned about the seam allowance not being even, please pull this guy out. At this point, I usually eyeball those sort of things. And also another little tip, just in general to know, is make sure you know the measurements of your hands. That's kind of a weird thing to say, but like if you know that your thumb is 3/4 of an inch, or you know that your pinky is like 1/2 inch wide or whatever, those sort of things help, especially in times like these where you're kind of eyeballing it and you're like, okay, that makes sense. So that's something that I do a lot of, kind of learned it a while back. So as I said, once you have everything pinned in place, you're going to go ahead and single thread. You don't need a double thread for this. It's not like it's a button. You'll be doing this enough all the way through, so it's not just going to fall off or anything, but you're going to go ahead and do an invisible slip stitch. And I'm going to go ahead and pick up some of, I like to go the back way first for my first stitch. So I picked up a little bit of the of the shell fabric and then a little bit of the lining. So at this point, you basically have finished the entire lining as soon as you start doing the slip stitch, this invisible slip stitch all over the jacket. I've already done this part and you kind of see it already looks pretty good so far. So I'm gonna go ahead and just keep going all the way around. Definitely do not let this sort of thing intimidate you if you want to give it a try. You obviously do not have to do it on such a big jacket as I did, just because I like to go big or go home. But if you are wondering about, you know, being able to watch this video again and really get those instructions, please head on over to my website. I'm going to have like a PDF download in case you wanted to add it to your sewing book, just so you'd kind of be able to you know, refer to it. So it'll basically just be a breakdown of what I talked about in the video in case you wanted to check it out. Also check out Christina's blog, because she will be you know, showing her version of this, and on her version of this particular jacket she did a bagged lining, which is a completely different skill. I mean, it's still dealing with the same, you know, piece of the garment, but the way you approach it is very different. So head on over to her blog, because she shows some pictures in there that might be interesting in case you wanted to pursue that sort of lining. Also, she did this really awesome version of her jacket where she had the leopard print collar, which I thought was super cool, and it just kind of makes me want to make my own fur or faux fur collar for this jacket. So we'll see, maybe there'll be a video in the future about that. So I hope you enjoyed this video on how to line a jacket using vintage techniques. I know it's a little bit more complicated and a little bit more work, but it's totally worth it, and it makes such a difference with how awesome it looks and feels on the inside. Please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe if you want to see more similar tutorials. And don't forget to check out Christina's post. I will be linking that down in the description box below. She has made such a beautiful jacket. You definitely don't want to miss out on it. Bye guys.